Good morning, everyone. So we're going to get started. Good morning. My name is Craig Willingham. I'm the Deputy Director here at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. We're a research and action center based here at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and we focus on a wide range of food policy related topic areas. One of which is the area of democracy. And while on the surface the concept of democracy may not immediately connect with the concept of food policy, we see a robust food system as one that is informed by the democratic will of the folks who are working, purchasing food, who are producing food in the food system. And with that in mind, we thought that it would be a really opportunistic time to talk about our hopes, our expectations, and our cautious optimism about the 2020 elections. We saw some shifts in the midterm elections, particularly at the federal level, and in New York, some very radical shifts. But what does all that mean for food policy, and many of the other issues that the various constituencies around the city and around the country are looking to see movement on? And that's what we're looking forward to talking about today. What are the sorts of things that we can expect to see, and what are the things that we think that elected officials should be concerned about moving into the 2020 elections? I'm going to do a brief introduction of our keynote speaker, and for more information, you can look at the handouts that are available over there, which has speaker bios for all of our panelists today. Today, our keynote speaker is Karen Spangler, Director of Policy and Program Operations at Food Policy Action, where she leads the development of Food Policy Action's annual scorecard, conducts policy analysis for FPA, and coordinates outreach and digital advocacy. Before joining FPA, Karen worked on healthy food access, urban agriculture, and policy in Michigan. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Food Policy Action, they're a wonderful organization that does a great job at tracking what legislators are actually doing related to food policy, and putting together really informative documentation about voting records, about policy stances, et cetera. And I highly recommend that you check out their site. So with that, I'm going to invite Karen up on stage, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Craig. So before I dive all the way in, I want to explain a little bit about Food Policy Action and some of the things that I'll focus on today. So one of the things that we can do, both through our educational tools, as Craig mentioned, our annual scorecard, our Eater's Guide to Congress, is that we can get involved in electoral work. It allows us to make the connection for voters between why an issue matters, how a legislator voted, and what that means for you when you're in the ballot box. So we started out first with our polling information. So we want to start out with things that are starting out with objective information about how our messages resonate with audiences. Our polling information from Lake Research Partners, the firm that we work with, has worked a lot on these issues, indicates that messages around safe, healthy, affordable food for all can persuade low turnout voters in suburban areas, especially unmarried, college-educated women of all races with and without children. And why that's important is that we want to get involved in areas where we can make a difference in an election. We want to invest our resources where it can make a difference in electing food leaders. This issue can also be a powerful mobilizer for women of color to get out and vote. And so we're looking at both persuading and mobilizing low turnout voters. And we know from polling research that voters expect incumbents to vote for good food policies. And when they find out that their representatives voted otherwise, they are rightfully angry. The best way to reach these voters who are busy, as all of us are, is to invest in paid, targeted advertising on social media. So that model informs some of the work that we have done in the past elections and that we see as important going into future elections. So we're looking at a vital slice of voters in 2020. The ability to both persuade and mobilize can change the outcome of the election. In an age of a lot of political advertising, we focused on providing objective information and empowering this important slice of voters. So our educational tools, like an Eater's Guide to Congress, which is our 6-year scorecard. So we looked at, since Food Policy Action was founded in 2012, what are the votes that House members have taken on a full range of food issues. So these provide objective information on voting records, and we connect these votes to kitchen table issues in targeted advertising so people are aware of candidates' voting records and can decide for themselves. Closer to Election Day, we focused on mobilizing voters. We work a lot with chefs and as advocates. They're a really powerful communicator, and they created videos with us that emphasized values. So how important it is to vote, what are the values they're bringing with them into the voting booth, whether their value is safe, affordable, healthy food, or whether the value is civic engagement in the process and making sure your voice is heard. They also talked a lot about providing information to make a concrete plan to ensure that people actually voted and that these food voters are getting to the polls. Food can be an issue that moves people. It doesn't move everyone, unfortunately. But as so many of these close races recently, just in the 2018 midterms have shown, as little as 1% to 2% can change the outcome of an election. So we focused on these low turnout voters so that our message uniquely speaks to. So food touches every important issue: health, immigration, the environment, the economy, and we link them in a way that's especially important to these key voters. So especially parents, they're putting food on the table 3 times a day. Healthy, safe, affordable food matters to everyone, but often voters take it for granted. It's when there's a dramatic disruption in the food system, like the recent outbreaks of foodborne illnesses just before Thanksgiving. There was the salmonella outbreak in Turkey that sickened at least 164 people, and then, of course, the nationwide romaine lettuce recall after 13 hospitalizations across 11 states. So when that happens, it becomes very apparent. This relates to 2020 in that food can play a role as a campaign issue in targeted places, and it's not going to be the same in every place or for every audience. So that's why we're focusing in on messages and communicators that can persuade women, especially low turnout women voters, by showing them what the legislators' records are, and motivate voters who might be on the fence about turning out. So finding especially important audiences for get out the vote messages. Targeted messages to voters for whom these issues matter can persuade and mobilize, and that's what we're going to take into 2020 as well. All right, thank you. Technical support, always appreciated. So some of the lessons that we learned from 2018, as I mentioned, we looked at targeted races where we could make a difference. So, and based on our polling, we spoke to a slice of low turnout voters. We tested on different audiences, tested different messages around food, and we found that our messages had the potential to persuade specifically white married women in the suburbs and to mobilize white unmarried women and women of color to get out the vote. So when we're looking at persuading or mobilizing these kind of slices of voters, that 1% to 2%, that's what we're testing and working on honing in on. We chose some specific close races because of these demographics and worked with some of the communicators that I mentioned to stay focused on a few key audiences. We really did a lot of digital media. It's an increasingly important part of our everyday lives. We're living our lives online, whether it's Facebook or shopping or communicating with friends. And so digital campaigns are an increasingly powerful political tool because they meet voters where they are, which, if you are like me, is usually looking at your phone. So our digital campaign targeting this slice of eligible voters with messages of safe, healthy, affordable food and the ways that it reaches our plates helped make a difference in two really closely watched congressional races, some of the most closely watched congressional races in the country. So we chose these two close races, Virginia 7 and California 25. So our friend on your left here is Dave Bratt and Steve Knight here on the right. So we called them ripe for the picking. This is our internal joke. We consider these races because of the food, because of the members' truly terrible records. That's where we start. We start with looking at what's their score on our scorecard annually and their lifetime score. What have they actually done? And we focus on House races as the arena where we can have the most impact because of the size of the investment in the race. And we closely tracked toss-up or leaning races throughout the year to see how they developed. So in Virginia 7, Congressman Dave Bratt had an 8% score, lifetime score, on food policy actions, Eater's Guide to Congress. So he had a lot of bad votes to choose from, you can imagine, with an 8%. But he specifically voted 4 times against preserving food safety rules and to make it drastically harder to enact any new regulations. That would include food safety, including food safety specifically. And in California's 25th district, Congressman Steve Knight had a 32% lifetime score on an Eater's Guide to Congress. And he actually voted the same 4 times against safer food and also 3 times against pesticide protection in our water, and another 4 times voted to make it harder for consumers to know what's in their food. So things like labeling and transparency. So we felt pretty confident that we had a lot to talk about these people's records. We monitored these races closely as they developed, and we chose places where we could make a difference, and no one else was going to speak to the specific slice of voters that we could reach. So our ability to reach suburban, married white women with a persuasion message and to mobilize unmarried women and women of color fit with the demographics of each district. So we're starting with who's terrible, and then looking at, on top of that, where can we make the difference? Some of our biggest assets for communicating this election season included validators who can speak to target audiences, particularly the chefs that I mentioned before. And we find that messages resonate better when it's someone the audiences relate to, either that they see frequently or that they have something in common with. So we were really honored to have the help of our diverse chef network highlighting their recipes, called the recipes for voting, to these individuals, urging them to get to the polls and vote. So this included Andrew Zimmern, who a lot of you might know from television's Bizarre Foods, Katie Button, who is a chef in Asheville, North Carolina, Joy Crump in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So she was really close to the Dave Bratt target audience that we were looking at. And then Marie Iniguez, who's the chef owner of Bocadillo Slow Roasted in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And all of these people have worked with us before, advocating in Congress, especially around issues of food access and affordability. So this is something that they felt really strongly about. In these videos, they shared why, as chefs, voting is important to them and the concrete steps that they were taking to make sure they got to the polls. Andrew shared an educational message with concrete steps on how he was setting aside time to vote. And he not only filmed the video for us, but he shared it on his social media platforms, which helped drive traffic to our website and our other assets. So working kind of all together as a digital campaign. And these are the kind of resources, like I said, where we're providing information and then also speaking to values. These videos felt really personal. Katie, Marie, and Joy also each had something unique to share about their personal experiences and their values and how those inform their vote. An Eater's Guide to Congress, food policy action is best known for our scorecard. And in 2018, we published an Eater's Guide to Congress, which covered 55 House votes since our first scorecard in 2012. So for members who've been in the House for all 6 years, they've taken multiple votes on these issues. Like I mentioned with Dave Bratt and Steve Knight, they've had the chance to vote multiple times on food safety, on pesticides, on hunger. So for many members, this is not a one-year snapshot. This is a long-term view of positions they've consistently taken on the most important food issues. We provide information, but we didn't want to stop there. So right next to information on the legislators' votes, we included questions to ask about these votes, had state-specific fact sheets on the impact, and immediately linked to actions they could take, like ways to contact their legislator easily through email or social media, and linking to voting resources so they can actually take action on Election Day. So for busy members of the public, especially people with children, abstract policy issues really come down to simple solutions, like whether or not the food that they are purchasing and putting on the kitchen table for their families is safe and affordable. And Americans often assume that our food is safe, that the federal protections we have in place are strong enough, but as these recent outbreaks have demonstrated, that's not always true. And it's in crises like these that the importance of federal protections become really visible to eaters. So even before these most recent outbreaks, we had issues with chicken, cookies, spices, and given that, why would you vote for a congressperson that wants to dilute or weaken food safety laws? So these are examples of some of the social media assets that we used in our targeted advertising. Issues that can seem fairly abstract, like regulatory rollbacks or annual budgets and appropriations, can mean that the food that gets to our plates isn't really safe because there is less funding for food safety inspections, fewer programs to help producers meet food safety standards, and reduced ability on the part of the FDA to respond to outbreaks. So we work really hard to connect the real-life consequences of votes in Congress. So that's the analysis that FPA is providing to the public so they can make informed decisions about their own members. An additional layer for 2020 will be administrative accountability. So, of course, it's in everyone's minds that the next presidential election is coming up. And in addition to congressional issues, administrative issues that the executive agencies have the chance to have the authority over, that will also be kind of up for a referendum. This is like things like the regulatory rollbacks that we covered in our State of the Plate report in 2018. This is something that the Trump administration will be directly accountable for to voters. To use the food safety example previously, consumers are taking for granted that the FDA and USDA are super abstract, but what it means is that they are making workers kill, process, and pack more chickens or turkeys per minute. And this change was made over the objections of food safety advocates, animal welfare organizations, and workers. Because, as all of us know, when something is a lot faster, it's harder to do well. And that has real consequences, as we can see. There's also growing demand from consumers for organic and humanely produced food. Just recently in the election, California voted to expand the protections around space for animals in production. But just last year, the Trump administration withdrew a rule for the National Organic Program, which had been 10 years in the making for organic livestock and poultry producers to give animals more room and access to the outdoors. So consumers are concerned about animal welfare, and they believe that when they buy organic, that seal, they can trust that these animals were treated well. And then finally, parents and scientists are concerned about pesticide exposure for children at a time when their brains are just forming. But despite these concerns, the Trump administration reversed a ban on chlorpyrifos, which is a nerve agent pesticide. It was one of the first things they did. And recently, this fall, pushed out the EPA's Director of Child Health. So there will be plenty for voters to consider in 2020 about the real tangible impacts of the rather complicated federal rulemaking process. So, and I illustrated this just with another example of some of the communications, the digital assets that we used. Bottom line is that food might never rise to the top issue for any election unless there's like an outbreak of food poisoning in that district just before election day. You know, mostly we are going to see the economy or healthcare, some of these major broad issues. But what we can do, what FPA does, and why we think our message is so critical, is we target the voters who don't usually go to the polls and who believe their elected official is good on the issue and they're angry when they find out they're not. And that motivates these voters to get out and vote. So our scorecard gives them a resource to get the facts. Our targeted work gives them the information in an easy to digest format. And our polling tells us this is a motivating issue for key voters who can make a difference in a close election. And food shouldn't be a partisan issue. But especially as we saw through our 6-year scorecard, House Republicans in particular have made it so. In these 55 separate votes, House Republicans shot down legislation written to preserve federal food stamps for hungry children and families, safeguard the environment, protect consumers, and support smaller acreage farmers. So this is one of the reasons that on average, House Republicans got a score of 20% on an Eater's Guide to Congress, is these repeated actions that they have taken and that the leadership has taken. So in 2020, we will be communicating this and looking at races where we can make a difference. And these are the kind of issues that will have a chance to make a difference in these really close elections. All right. Thank you.
So I'll actually ask you questions.
Yeah.
In a moment, and that will we go through the panel discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Should I pass it out? Do you have preference to reset?
So thank you so much. Very informative. And again, Food Policy Action provides some really great resources to understand the various policy positions and policy actions of our elected officials. So next up, I'm going to invite Dennis Derrick up to provide a little bit more context with respect to a perspective from New York City. And Dennis is a professor of professional practice at the Milano School of International Affairs at the New School, and he's also the founder of Corbin Hill Food Project, which I know many of you in this room are familiar with. So, Dennis, come on up. The mic is pretty sensitive too. I always feel like I need to lean in, but they can actually hear you.
Thanks, Craig. If you can't hear me, just snap. Okay, because I've just also had all the surgery and I'm not hearing as well as I would like to. I think that others are hearing me. Oh, okay. And for that reason, I also, first of all, I want to thank you, Craig, for inviting us here. And Karen, you know, what you present this morning and what I'm going to be talking about and others are going to be talking about shows the complexity of the issues that we're faced with in the society in general around food and the role that it plays. And without your work, it isn't possible, it makes it impossible for me to even start thinking about where should we be after 2020 and where we should be in 2030. And so within that context, it's within that context that I would like to make a few remarks. First of all, I think the issue of accountability is extraordinarily important. And I think that that is really part of, and for us in New York City, in New York State, we are in a position where we think we can add to your agenda, as opposed to saying, we want a new agenda. Because I don't think any of this is one-dimensional at all, okay? So at the state level, for the first time, we have the Democrats are in charge of both houses. And we talk about, in the city, there's a lot of rhetoric about the fact that we live in the reality of two cities, the poor and the rich. And so it's within that context that I'd like to frame what I would think would be an add-on beyond the next 2020, that hopefully you will, because in terms of your ability to be able to be impactful, there are a lot of things that we need to learn from you in terms of how you go about doing it as we introduce another layer of the dimension. I don't know how many of you have read the 10-year report that's called for the food policy in New York City since 2008. But it's a significant document because if you're not familiar with that document and that 10-year history that covers some 20 public reports, some 420 recommendations, 37 food metrics indicators, and the top 40 policy issues that were being emphasized, you don't begin to understand where we're coming from in terms of across the country in general, not just New York City, what has become the new add-on agenda to the work that you're doing. And a lot of this has to do with three issues or three areas that are normally not addressed and not even part of the ongoing discussion at almost any food conference that one attends. The first of it is, amongst the 6 areas that were to be emphasized, 3 were totally neglected in terms of the reports over that 10-year period. One of them having creating food systems that support economic and community development, which is really interesting, because even if it did, there's a whole new redefinition that's emerging around what community development around food means. And that whole thinking has not really kind of sunk into this discussion. The other area that was neglected was support of food workers, because almost none of this could be done if we're not willing to support our food workers. And if you think $15, I don't know how many people in this room are willing to raise their hands and tell me they could live in New York City earning $15 an hour. Raise your hands if you think you can. Yet, notice, not a single hand has gone up, yet that's what we're fighting for. I thought I'd at least see one hand. Okay. The other area that was totally neglected has to strengthen food governance and democracy. So that if we don't, because part of what you're doing is also doing that, and I think it has to be done in a different way. But it's interesting in terms of New York City, and in the report that was done, and Craig, you folks really need to take enormous amount of credit for that report, which I think, how many people are familiar with that report? Okay, good. So therefore there's a context that I can talk about, okay? It means that if we think of those 3 areas, governance and democracy, supporting food workers, and economic development, we have to start talking that let's talk about community development. There's the knowledge that there's a definition of community development is being redefined by many blacks and Latinx. Not in a traditional way, and that we have talked about community development. There are a different set of processes. And so one of the things that, some water please. And one of the things that we must think about as we think of new policies really has to do, thank you. Too many drugs, folks. One of the things we have to talk about is what does this legislation need to look like? So that, for instance, we now have we just passed in terms of the last election, a new piece that brings into place a citizens participation panel. What is that going to look like? What are the real goals of it? It's nice to talk about citizen participation. How meaningful is that going to be? So that we think of community budgeting process. That's really one of those things in which that is not the same as a community in an advisory role. And folks, we have so many advisory roles. And I've been on committees that have advised and advised and advised and advised. And I don't see any of it necessarily reflecting in what communities necessarily say they want. And so what we're really talking about is the shifting of decision-making power. And if we don't think about shifting decision-making power, then I don't know what it means for democratizing the whole area here. The second thing, the other piece of that dimension is we have to intentionally, and I know folks don't love to hear this, we have to intentionally filter these policies and their impacts and their measures around racial equity. And so it's fascinating to me that in democracy, in much of the report, the metrics for measuring any of these things were not there in those reports, so that we can talk in the generalities that we normally do. Okay, let me just kind of make this brief, because I think you'd like to do that. And I can pick up a lot of these themes in terms of the discussion. We have to talk about what participatory research really means when we talk about the community, what the community had a voice. What does that mean in terms of participatory research? We act in environmental justice 20 years ago, 30 years ago, set up a completely different model in which they were the PIs, the principal investigators, and Columbia University was the subcontractors. So we have to talk about all of these particular relationships. And we also have to talk about it in terms of a new economy that's being created. And how do we create this new economy? We see snippets of it in the city council in terms of the money that they've put in for training for co-ops. But there's so many different ways in which we can talk about what that new economy should entail, that we have to talk about what should those policies be, what are the metrics for that, and how do we keep folks accountable. Let me leave it there for now. This is not a real, let me say, it doesn't include the masala and all these other ingredients that should go into this new menu, but I think you get a sense that where we're going in terms of our own thinking. And quite frankly, we can't do any of that work if you don't continue to do the work you're doing. And I think what we're talking about is how do we layer these structures. Thanks.
So if the panelists could come and have a seat on the stage, we'll get started for the discussion portion. Thank you, Dennis. And, a lot of what you talked about really is about envisioning what the future can and should look like. And, that's the ultimate motivation for democratic participation, being able to shape what the future of your society looks like. And, but how we get there is very complicated. And, the current political environment, dictates that certain tools that work now in order to affect political change may not be the best tools for the future. And what we want to talk about today is how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be. And I'm going to start off with a question for you, Robin, since you're the only person we haven't heard from yet. Robin Vitale is the Vice President of Health Strategies for the American Heart Association in New York City. Again, if you want to find out more information about Robin, you can check out her bio in the flyer that's available over there on the table. So Robin, you've worked a lot with elected officials. So in the wake of the midterm elections, what sort of food policy related issues are you hopeful about seeing progress on over the next 2 years? And which are you a little bit more cautious about?
Thank you so much, Craig, and really happy to be here on this panel with all these esteemed professionals. It's fun to kind of that cleanup after both of you have had a chance to kind of do this outline and the deep dive. The Heart Association, I should clarify, as a 501c3 organization, we are not in a position to be able to do half of the fun work that Karen's able to do in D.C., really getting into the battlegrounds with some of these very key, significant issue areas. We are not political, we're legislative, and we're able to work with anyone once they're elected. We have to figure out how to motivate those individuals, regardless of what their ideology or personal life perspective might be. It can be challenging at times to exist within that paradigm, but we're very interested in how things have evolved over the last few months since the midterm elections, and I think we're looking with a decent sense of aspiration that there is hope that we can try to start advancing some of these significant food policy needs. I'll certainly defer to Karen and the focus around some of the federal initiatives that we're hoping to rally around. I know we're all as a society very interested in what's going on with the public charge rule that's coming to a head, as well as the Farm Bill and other issue areas. We're certainly concerned about what the current administration has been talking about in D.C. and how they've gone about sidestepping some obstacles and coming to terms with their base versus what the larger communities really need. I think at the state level, we have some real significant opportunities as we're looking at a new paradigm of power in the state Senate, and obviously matching that power influence in the House, or in the Assembly in our case, and I'm thinking about what that potential new legislative landscape can look like. For years, we've seen out of the Assembly significant support to underserved communities, thinking about how those voiceless in New York, across the state of New York, have an opportunity to benefit from public policy, and certainly food is part of that as a significant area of concern. It's always been challenging, however, to match that same culture on the state Senate. The state Senate had often been more influenced by economic concerns, and a lot of the topics we talk about on the food scale as well as others impacting health are at times very costly, and shifting that economic structure around can be challenging in the onset. And so we're very interested in how this new state Senate and those that are coming into positions of influence on the Health Committee and other committees that can help move this forward can help to really prioritize that. So in that space, we're looking at things related to healthy food access, thinking about how the state in the past has done some significant work around what's called a Healthy Food Financing Initiative. There was an existing program, Healthy Food, Healthy Communities Fund, for more than a decade that resulted in a good 25 new food markets being built around the state of New York in communities that needed that help the most. That program is no longer being funded. It has gone away as a result. So something that had been very successful is no longer operational, which is obviously concerning. But we're also looking at things that relate into child health as well with food, thinking about school wellness policies, nutrition standards, things that can really, I think, be motivated significantly in this new landscape. So we're excited about the potential. I would say that we have a healthy dose of caution, because as we're already seeing, as the powers that be are being settled in Albany, there's going to be a lot of distraction. They've been, especially on the Assembly side, able to talk about their priorities for decades now, about what they would do if they had complete power and influence. A lot of promises were being made to various constituencies. And so now that they're actually in that position to get things done, there's going to be a significant volume of opportunity. Everyone's going to want those promises to fall into place. And what does that mean? What does that look like? And have the food policy priorities, how are they going to be prioritized? So I would say we're healthy. We're in a very healthy position thinking about the progress of food policy work, but realizing that we're going to have to be very loud in our approach.
Great. Thank you. And Karen, I want to direct the next question to you. Considering today's political environment and the wide range of concerns about where the country is headed around issues related to climate change, immigration, et cetera, which food policy issues do you think could resonate the most in this current political period, where we have really a number of very high-profile issues that aren't necessarily food-related, that are, taking up a lot of the energy and efforts of activists?
I think that a lot of it will come. Good. I think a lot of it will come down to what affects people's everyday lives the most. That's one of the reasons that we fall back on that food safety example.
I want to put a little closer.
Okay. That food safety example so much is because it's something that really is in the background until it's not. And when it's not, it's very dramatic. So I do think that a lot of people's priorities around food will be around access and access to healthy food, and then affordability. Of course, economic issues are always huge in any election, and food is one of the biggest. We also find that messages around health really resonate with voters, that people do understand the link between what we eat, what our children eat, and what that means for their future. And so those kinds of issues, I think, will continue to be increasingly important as well.
And do you see common cause amongst folks who are concerned about the environment, who are concerned about immigration, et cetera? Do you see common cause in some of those topic areas that you could say, okay, well, this aspect of policy X could relate, in a very clear way to environmental policy or immigration policy, et cetera?
I do think there's been a lot of progress in that vein. I think that there's a lot of great coalition work that's happening to bring together, sustainable agriculture and people who are SNAP advocates. And even if you look at large environmental organizations, they might have somebody that's dedicated to agriculture policy now or food policy, where they didn't, 15 or 20 years ago. So I do think there's growing recognition of how these issues intersect. But of course, when it comes down to the specific priorities, that's always going to be difficult to negotiate at the last minute, or difficult when it comes down to the details of what a specific policy actually does. But I think there's been tremendous progress in working together.
Yeah, and I think that level of difficulty is one of the reasons, again, why it's important to have these sort of conversations early. So it's not at the last minute that everyone's trying to come together in order to push a common goal. It's something that's been thought through, discussed, and the sort of organic path forward is already apparent, as opposed to trying to figure that out at the last minute. Dennis, Corbin Hill's always been focused on increasing food access and creating new pathways to ownership and wealth creation. How can we convince elected officials that changes to existing food policies could be one of the ways of addressing the racial wealth gap in New York City and around the country?
Yeah, I really think it's important that we talk about the wealth gap, because it's a word that we never use when we're in our community. It's not part of the vocabulary of any of the discussions that go on at these meetings. And the reality is, I think there are two distinct areas. One has to do with the income gap based on salaries. That's very different from the wealth gap. And I think that really what we're talking about is to what extent can we now create the kind of community wealth in which the investments in our community around food is not one that's extractive in nature. Fundamentally, that's really what has been happening. There are many people who talk about the bodegas and so forth, and I'm not picking on them because I can think of bigger examples that in terms of the city government and so forth has invested money in, but almost all of them are extractive in nature. Communities own very little. We cannot even talk about wealth. We think about us in terms of low-income communities as simply consumers. We're not economic citizens. And to participate in that kind of economy, an economy in this city that exceeds $5 billion. Yet at the same time, this is what I'm saying, that complements what you're doing, because I think what you're doing is necessary, but I guess in my own mathematical training, I normally define it as necessary, but not sufficient. And so how are we going to deal with this racial gap? Now, you want to know what we have been talking about, and there are a whole series of groups, Black and Latinx groups across the country who have been, there's so many meetings going on this whole issue of community wealth and so forth that is just really stunning. And they have begun to define a whole series of actions and how things should be shaped and formed and the processes involved and the importance of community ownership in terms of the decision making and so forth. There's even a hint in some of your reports that even all of the 15 to 20 stores that were built, brick and mortar pieces that were built across the city, that many of the people in the communities are not that particularly happy with them because they don't feel any sense of ownership. And your study really kind of hints to it. Doesn't quite say it that way, Craig, but you know what I'm saying. So that I think, we don't have all the answers because fundamentally what we're doing is we're struggling in terms of a new economy that's trivial in nature to the regular ongoing capitalist system. And we all have our feet in one or the other or in both and trying to figure out how we mix and match and make this work for our communities. Because all that's involved, and you just have to take a look at the underwriting laws and all of the discrimination that's built into those underwriting laws. But we don't talk about those kinds of things at food conferences, and why we in the community can't own things. So it begins in a very fundamental way for us over the next 2 to 3 years to begin to build that constituency the way you have been able to build yours, to identify the elected officials who are going to begin to marshal around what we see as a longer-term vision about what it means to create wealth in communities. And that's a discussion that there's very little, well, only recently in the last 2 or 3 years, you've begun to see some particular writings about this. And that educational process with elected officials will take time. And then with term limits and so forth, it complicates it when you can do it. Just the time you've nurtured people, they may decide not to run or may not win, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to also develop the kind of scores and the metrics that measure where they are on all of this.
And this concept of the racial wealth gap is one that is creeping into a lot of different policy areas, not just remaining in the area of poverty, but also being talked about and how that can be used in order to transform, again, food policy, environmental policy, et cetera. And one of the sort of promising developments is that a component of this racial wealth gap issue or racial wealth gap discussion has been baby bonds. And I'm forgetting Derek Hamilton, but why am I not remembering his name? The senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker. Cory Booker recently put out a position paper in favor of baby bonds. I don't know where that's going to go, but again, this is one of these discussions that will start to become increasingly a part of the overall picture of how we transform not only just the food system but also the economy and society in general. Robin, I want to ask you, in assessing the current political landscape and with an eye towards 2020, and considering your experience working with elected officials in the past on food policy, advocates should try to avoid in seeking to gain political traction for food-related causes. And you mentioned that you work across the spectrum, and I think depending on what the various positions that advocates are coming from, there can often be a mismatch in discussion and conversation around how you get your point across. What do you think that they should be mindful of moving forward?
Oh, those mistakes that we make at times. Yeah. I think the themes that have been brought up by my fellow panelists really resonate with this question specifically, because you really need to do your due diligence when you're speaking to the elected official that you're hoping to cultivate as a champion. Learning what's going to motivate them, what is their background, what is their district look like. When the new city council came in over a year ago, we, the Heart Association, took a deep dive and started to really learn a little bit more about these new council members, the individuals that are coming in as new chairs of targeted committees, our speaker, obviously being the past chair of the Council Health Committee, we already had a very wonderful relationship with him as a champion, and so that was a pretty easy transition to take place. But a really quick little story, we had some meetings with individuals that were going to have some influence over access to places to be physically active, thinking about parks and recreation and so on. And some of those conversations were not as successful as they probably should have been, because we went in there with the assumption that there's going to be an understanding that there are communities in New York City that lack this access. And they're looking from the lens of their own district that have had the benefit of geography and investment, and they did not easily initially understand kind of what we were trying to advocate for. So that has evolved over time, which is wonderful, but it's definitely, I think, something that we need to embrace in the food policy world as well, realizing that right now, both in Albany and certainly in New York City with City Council, we do have, I think, tremendous synergy with our elected officials. They get it, they understand it. Many of them are very passionately embracing progressive policy standards. They all want to kind of carry that banner for us and really drill down into, we want to help the communities that need the help the most. But you never want to go in there with the assumption that that is going to resonate across all boundaries. So thinking about what is going to motivate your key influencers, is it the economy? And I think one of the great things about food policy is that it transcends all of those boundaries. Food certainly equals health, food equals medicine, but food equals jobs, food equals economy, and thinking about how you message that and how you can make any food policy a priority through those lenses has to be part of your strategy.
Right, yeah. Just want to add to that, because this whole sense of what I fear most in terms of I saw your sign. What I fear most is the fact that our elected officials and too many people in public accept what Derek Hamilton calls 11 myths about wealth creation, so that more education will get us there. Well, the reality is, you compare across race and across gender, that is not true. I mean, and so you have a whole series of myths that I think it's so easy for elected officials to kind of fall into the trap of saying, oh yes, we can do some more of this. Home ownership is going to really create wealth. Well, the reality is, it hasn't, in terms of what it's worth, or that more savings on the part of low-income folks. Well, we already know low-income folks proportionately they give more to nonprofits than anybody on a proportional basis than any other group, and we know that they save more proportionately. So all of these kinds of myths that exist that sort of don't deal with the underlying structure of racial equity, access to assets, in terms of capital, really is the big issue I worry about in terms of errors that we would make, and that it's so much easier for them to perpetuate the myth than deal with the underlying truth.
Karen, you talked about two particular races that your organization focused on. Are there any other races that, based on the electoral outcome, that you're confident that because of the changes that we're going to see in the incoming Congress, that you'll see some movement on a particular food policy issue?
Yeah, more than any one particular race, I really think that it came down to how close so many of them were, really unexpectedly close.
In some cases, just 50
right.
votes.
I mean, like, as I was, writing my keynote, I was like, some of these are still undecided. So I think that will really inform people's approach in the future to kind of hone in even more on the really small, but like getting out every vote that can really make a difference. I think also we saw a lot of state level change. So for instance, in Colorado is now pretty solidly blue. The governor that they elected, Jared Polis, he was a member of Congress that had a 97% on our scorecard. But Colorado has one Republican senator, and that person is up. Cory Gardner's up for re-election in 2020. So those kind of changes, both in the demographics of a state and the politics of a state, I think, are going to be very important going forward. I think also the expansion of the electorate through measures to enfranchise people, like for instance in Florida, that of course also is going to have a huge impact on who is able to vote and the importance of turning out people to vote.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on into the question and answer period. Microphones will be floating around. If you have questions, raise your hand and a microphone will be directed towards you. So, any questions? One right there.
No, actually, I have a statement. I'm Linda Laviolette from the New York State Department of Agriculture. I'd like to all thank you for your work in this area. I have a suggestion. We developed a tool while I was at ESD called the Community Food Systems Assessment, and I think that could be a valuable tool for communities to build support for food policy. You can do it. Carlos Menchaca, the councilman from Sunset Park, has recently done a community food systems assessment in Red Hook. And if you do it in the community and you do it yourself, you're building a coalition of community groups around issues that are really targeted for what that community needs to do. And that can be a very useful tool in driving food policy. I'm happy to share that with anybody who would like it. I mean, there is a business that has grown up around the country with hiring consultants to do these community food systems assessment. They can cost between $50,000 and $100,000. And honestly, there's no reason why communities should pay that money. They can use this template. They can build a coalition in their community, and they can use that to drive local food policy.
And for those who don't know, ESD is Empire State Development.
Right.
And what's the name of the tool again, if you could repeat it?
The Community Food Systems Assessment. And we're happy to make it. I'll provide the information to you.
Sure, we have it, but for others.
That actually brings up a really another very important point, and thank you for bringing that up to everyone's attention. Another theme that we should probably touch on as far as the potential for mistakes in advocacy is to not utilize resources like that and to not focus on the need to prioritize or elevate the community voice. I think Derek's focus on some of the inequities that have inadvertently or perhaps advertently happened over time with some of these policies being put in place that didn't have the community focus. We want to make sure that truly impactful food policy is being community-led, community-driven, and it's going to have the type of intended impact that we want to see achieved. So whether it's using a tool like that really builds that assessment from the ground up so that we know exactly what it is that's going to benefit that community, or making sure that the coalition partners around the table truly represent the community voice, that has to be a priority as well. Thanks for bringing that up.
Other questions? In the back.
I heard you say 20% was average score. Average score for Republicans. I heard 20% was their average score. I was wondering, maybe I missed it, what the average score is for Democrats.
Yeah, the average 6-year score for Democrats in the House was 93%. So there's definitely a pretty stark divide, and that certainly doesn't. That's certainly not every member. It is a nonpartisan tool, so there are very higher scoring Republicans and lower scoring Democrats for sure, based on their positions on some of these policies. But definitely it reflects the party's priorities over the 6 years that we scored, particularly the leadership, because food policy action, we can only score floor votes. Those are the things that we have, information on everyone's vote across the board, to be fair. And the House leadership determines a lot of what gets to the floor and gets voted on. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, those were very, very partisan bad bills.
Yeah, I like to throw something in about this business of creating wealth in a community. I am the team leader for Plant Pure Communities in the Bronx, and I am, along those lines, very involved in teaching people a whole food, plant-based diet. But one of the things that is difficult is to get support for, frankly, things that don't cost money. You know, as soon as there's money involved, you get all kinds of people showing up. But if they don't cost money, and some of the solutions are the best. For instance, I found out in the last few years there is a not-for-profit that is called the Suppers Programs, and it was started by a lady in New Jersey who had a health problem and needed to follow a diet and was having a tough time getting support. And what she did was she created the support system for herself at home by doing with other people that also need to follow the diet a mutual support system where they cook alternately at each other's homes and share the grocery bill and whatever, and it costs nothing. The host collects the money, goes out, shops for the grocery, and the group shows up, and you cook together, and you eat together, and you clean up together, and that's your meeting. And that's fantastic, and it literally costs nothing other than the food you were going to eat anyway, you know? And I've been bringing this to the attention of people in my community, organizations and stuff, but like I say, I have this feeling it just falls on deaf ears because there's no money involved in doing it. And that's just one example, and there's probably a ton more. There's so much that we can often do. You know, and other things are, we have the example of Eric Adams in Brooklyn, who is a tremendous driver of change in this area. And I'm aware in the Bronx of at least two politicians, Fernando Cabrera and Luis Sepulveda, who themselves have had equally dramatic experiences as Eric Adams in this area, but you know, I don't see them really out advocating it the way Eric Adams is doing. So the next thing I'm doing is bringing Eric Adams to the Bronx and put them all to shame. So that's another thing we can do for free. Thank you.
I want to ask the panel, what do you think of this idea that, and from what I'm hearing, is that yes, there's not a dollar amount, but there's an amount of time and community investment that goes into, you know, putting something like that together. What do you think of this idea of, you know, community investment, community time, resident time versus investment by the city or the state in funds in order to be able to have a standalone version of that that's funded, that's operationalized in a very formal sort of way? Do you have an opinion on, you know, where you would like to see policy move towards more supporting what our director calls a community constructed food environment versus the market constructed food environment?
Not only community, absolutely, I would like to see funds being put into the whole community investment piece. And this goes to what I'm talking about as the future, because we don't know what those models would really look like and how we would want to write that legislation. And I would want to be very careful before we sort of commit to voting on these kinds of things. And I think that what we will see over the next 2, 3 years, 4 years, is a series of demonstrations around these kinds of things, and trying to find a political support. It may be through, you know, councilperson's independent grant or whatever the case may be, in which we can create a series of models of what's possible. I mean, we're in an interesting period in which we don't really have all the answers, and we have to really kind of test a lot of the notions around what do we mean by community, what is really community participation, decision making, and ownership. And I think that these are pieces that, you know, I throw them around sometimes. If pushed to help to define each and every one of them, it's not easy. And I will tell you that up front, that I don't have the answers necessary to all these definitions. But I think it's a process that's going on across the country, in which you're all struggling to define these things, and if we can get it translated to the point where the kinds of programs that you're talking about get supported, we'd be in great shape.
We do need to consider the balance between the two. There's so many examples of innovative health policies that start in the community and really thinking about what is going to resonate within those residents, whether it's a supper club idea or other aspects that are going to be really embraced by those neighbors. However, we also need to make sure that work is going to be sustainable beyond that one individual, that woman in New Jersey who started this concept. What happens when she's not available to do that kind of work anymore? So the benefit of having something codified in law is that it transcends the individual. So we want to make sure that when we have the opportunity to advance public policies, that we are leveraging all of that innovative work that's going on in the community, making sure that legislation is going to be drafted in a way that is going to have the most benefit for these communities, but making sure that we are able to codify this, institutionalize it, operationalize it, so that it is sustainable for the long term.
Emma, in the back. Your microphone's coming to you.
I work for Bronx Health Reach. I know many of you. There we go. So I am very optimistic overall nationally about the political changes. Locally, however, I'm still a little bit worried. As many of you know, the Bronx is 62 out of 62 in health outcomes and health behaviors in the state. We have many challenges. And we need a radical change, like a really radical change to actually make things different. We do talk about the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts again about how do we make that radical change? How do we work with existing and new electeds in the Bronx to actually do something different? And sort of what is the role of our governor? Is he an asset or potentially a barrier, especially considering his potential run for president?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. And I don't know if you've been following many of the discussions that's been going on within the Black and the Latinx community around the wealth issue. And we're all still struggling to try to get that defined. What we're really talking about is a new economy. That's when, at least that's how I define what you talk about as, a radical change. It clearly, capitalism has not worked for low-income folks. It's worked very well for me, but, that's because, I don't know, maybe because I came out of the 60s with a PhD, okay? And so I was one of those exceptions where even then I still had to fight the bank for over a year before I could get a loan, the first one in my neighborhood in Harlem, for a reconstruction loan. And they're telling me things about my debt to equity ratio is not right and so forth. And I had to look at the banker and ask him, do you know how to calculate one? Because I can calculate mine for you right now, and you're absolutely wrong. But that kind of level of the frustration around, it's not just the racial gap, it's what I would call the racism that underlies almost all of this stuff. And this is why you have to start thinking about a totally new economy, a total redefinition of what community means within that whole structure. What does it mean to have, we keep hearing all these wonderful phrases like win-win. There's no such thing. I mean, so if you read this recent book that calls Winner Take All, you begin to understand there's no such thing as win-win. And so how do you redefine this? And I think the biggest mistake that we make, I love foundations, I do use their money, and they do give me money, and I'm not going to knock it. But the reality is they're not equipped to deal with the structural issues. Most people forget that less than 10% of all foundation funding goes to low-income communities or to address low-income issues. Less than 10% of the billions that's given. And so the first thing we all think about is, how is this foundation going to help us do this little project? The reality is the nature of the problem is so large that you have to think about a new economy and how do you bring capital into that new economy where you don't have those underwriting laws, where basically you don't even have to begin to to pay off the principal for 10, 15 years when you are profitable. And we know what profitability means in the food area. It's not that obvious. So it's a very complicated issue, and I think that the fact that the discussion is actually surfacing is in itself, to me, I'm very optimistic, even though I don't have the answers.
And
I do want to just very quickly follow up on
that'll be the last word.
No pressure. But I do want to circle back to your focus around kind of the landscape that you have in the Bronx and kind of the viability we have on some of those policy areas. I think the Bronx, especially because they are in the worst rankings, the Not 62 campaign is going to be extremely relevant moving forward. The political power base is in the Bronx. You have your speaker, obviously, for the assembly. Has been in office for many, many years and speaker for many, many years. But you now also have the chair of the Senate Health Committee. And I think it's going to be incumbent for all Bronxites to make sure that these two individuals particularly hear from you often, continue that outreach, making sure that all of the promises that have been discussed over the last several years are going to be priorities for them moving forward into this new paradigm. Gustavo Rivera, as the incoming chair of the Senate Health Committee, he's a wonderful champion on many of these issues, very outspoken, very passionate about a lot of the inequality concerns and so on. Now it's time for him to flex some of those muscles and making sure that those promises are going to meet reality. So I think I'm extremely optimistic about the potential for some good things to be happening for the borough of the Bronx.
And I would just add that I think one of the sort of unintended positive outcomes from the Trump administration is that, he has taken an approach of constantly activating his base. And that in turn has meant that people who are on the left have felt the same need to be able to constantly activate their base. And that sort of, for lack of a better term, war footing nonstop, I think, ultimately is something that needed to happen at some point anyway. And, if it happened because of the way in which Trump has been, administering his policies and his approach to activating his base, and it forces others to do the same thing, it moves us further along in order to see change much more quickly than we normally would under conventional political circumstances. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you to the panelists. Very, very good discussion, interesting and engaging, and thank you to all of you. One final note, we do have another food policy forum. We typically have them every month, coming up on December 18th, and the topic is growing good food jobs in New York City. We recently released a report focusing on the various opportunities for jobs in the food system that pay a decent wage, that have benefits, some sort of pathway for advancement, and we'll be getting deeper into that discussion on December 18th. So if you're interested, please come. Our RSVP will be going out very, very soon, and there's also a flyer on the table with more details. Thank you.